And I thought, kindness, this very simple thing. And that is the reason that our Lenten series is Acts of Kindness, Witness to Kindness. And we're thrilled to welcome tonight our first speaker, our interviewee, the Honorable Lee Yeakel, who sat on the federal bench for a couple of decades, and before that was a lawyer in practice for several decades, and is a really sweet guy. And to welcome back our beloved former rector, Merrill Wade, who's also kind of a sweet guy, but don't tell him I said so. And so we'll just let them go at it. I've told several of you, I'm a little afraid. They had coffee together, and apparently it went on for quite some time. And I've told them both, I'm a little afraid that this is kind of like striking a match to firecrackers, but you can see for yourself.
Thanks, Kathleen. Lee and I were having a conversation downstairs that we didn't finish. So I just want to finish that little conversation, then we'll get started with the talk, okay? So last night we scored 20 runs.
Yeah.
The Horns really looked good. And you're a Longhorn fan. I mean, you've got Longhorn baseball on your license plate.
I do. It's a lot of people love football. A lot of people really like basketball. I like football. Basketball to me is my bridge sport. That's what you do between football and baseball. Mm-hmm. And baseball is the sport I like.
Yeah. Well, Judge, now you just retired. We're going to figure out by the end of this conversation what retirement means in your setting. But you're just one of us. You're of our kind. You were born somewhere. You were raised somewhere. Oklahoma City?
Oklahoma City.
Tell us a bit of your story, your childhood, and where you came up.
Or as we say, the city in Oklahoma. There's two cities of interest in Oklahoma, the city and Tulsa, and that's really about it. It's a lot smaller than Texas, I found when I came down here. If you're a politician in Oklahoma and you have access to a small plane, you can campaign statewide every day and sleep in your own bed wherever you live. You can't really do that in a state the size of France like Texas is. And I like to tell people that I was born and grew up in a third world state, Oklahoma, and it was a great place to grow up. I grew up in the 50s and the early 60s up there, the post-World War II years. In retrospect, I really think that might have been the best time to grow up in this country. Everybody was back from World War II. The Depression, of course, was over. Everybody just wanted to have a job. Everybody just wanted to take it easy and raise a family. And the rules were for me in the summer, be home by dark. And you can do anything you want to, but you darn well better do it on your bicycle. Children in those days didn't have this structured deal of orchestra and soccer and everything you do in the summer. And my mates and I would just take off in the morning and we'd be back in the evening and didn't really give too much thought to anything. Places were uniformly safer then, even in Oklahoma City, you could go into a bad part of town, but you had to be looking for trouble. It didn't find you kind of the way it finds people today. And then I became the ultimate trader and crossed the Red River after high school and entered the University of Texas, and my blood's run orange ever since then, to the chagrin of all my friends back in Oklahoma.
Now, there's a piece of story in that you had a relative in Houston that invited you to come down and work with him one summer, and apparently he had it already in mind. He was going to try to coax you not to go to Oklahoma, but to go to Texas.
Well, he really didn't do that, but I'll tell you how that happened, because it's an interesting story, because it shows you again that the major decisions in your life are made for the worst possible little bitty reasons, and you don't know it's a major decision. I was going to go to Oklahoma, to University of Oklahoma, It's where I was always planning on going to school. And I had an uncle who was vice president of a then major oil company in Houston, and I had two cousins, and the oldest one was exactly 2 months younger than I was, so we were very close. And then she had a younger sister, but close enough. And so in the spring of my senior year, my uncle called me and said, "What are you going to do before you go to college?" And I said, "Well, I haven't given any thought about it." And he said, "Well, why don't you come to Houston? I'll get you a job. You can live with us. Girls will be glad to see you. You'll have a good time." Well, I'm in Oklahoma City. Houston is like New York or London or somewhere, I mean, Oklahoma City was fine, but Houston was a big deal. So I go to Houston, and the first thing I find out about are corporate America's no nepotism rules about how they can't hire relatives. And well, Tenneco, which was the oil company he was with, was a big producer at that time. And so Dresser Industries was a large oil field equipment and services supplier to the oil companies. So the way that problem got solved is Dresser hired all the Tenneco exec kids for the summer, and Tenneco hired all the Dresser execs kids for the summer. So everybody had a job, and everybody was happy, and nobody violated any company rules. And so I had always had kid jobs in Oklahoma City. I worked in a restaurant, and it's not full time; it's low wage. I'm not even sure there was a minimum wage then. Kid job, and so suddenly I'm in Houston. I'm working full time. I'm getting paid an adult wage. I've never seen as much money in my life as what I was getting there. And so I hadn't been there very long, and a classmate of my cousin's, we're the same age, called to say she was having a party and could my cousin come. And my cousin said, "Well, my cousin's down here, but he's just our age. Can I bring him?" And I went and met this girl that was having this party and became totally infatuated with her. And so then the summer got really good because I'm making more money than I've ever seen and can spend more money than I've ever seen, and dating this wonderful girl. And in those days, the University of Texas started a full 4 weeks after the University of Oklahoma. Most schools by that time had moved the start of their fall semester up to where you finished at Christmas, and then took finals before Christmas, took the holidays off in your break, and came back. Well, not at Texas. You went up until Christmas, took a break, went back, were in class for a little bit, had finals. So I go into my boss, because I'm having too good a time to go to college on the 1st of September. And I said, "Jack, can you got any room for anybody for another 4 weeks?" And he said, "You?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Yeah, you're doing fine. You can work." So only because I was having a good time did I decide to go to the University of Texas. It wasn't by any pressure. But something worked out of all that, because I've now been married to that girl for 57 years, and she's sitting out there in the audience. So it's the little decisions that you think you make for no reason that govern all the rest of your life.
Going back, let's go way back. Where were you living when you were like between ages of, say, 7 to 10?
Oh, in Oklahoma City.
Okay, so what are some recollections you have? This theme is kindness, and kindness has some antonyms that we would rather not. Unkindness, and you explained or spread out what's possible malicious behavior and attitudes towards one another. But I'm thinking, what did you see and what do you recall that looking back on it was troublesome to you maybe, or?
Well, I don't know that we knew enough about it as kids to find it troublesome, but I grew up in a totally segregated society. There was a black high school in Oklahoma City, Frederick Douglass High School. A lot of cities had Frederick Douglass high schools. And I went to a 6-year junior-senior high school, which I really think was a better system than what we have now with middle schools, but that's a topic for a whole other discussion. But there were no African Americans in my high school at all. But you live through that situation, and you know it's different, but it's not to me, the way it is described now when we read about it. You knew that it was segregated. You never saw African Americans in restaurants. You never saw any on our end of town. As I said, we didn't go to high school. But it wasn't talked about. It wasn't, everybody at all the dinner table conversations talking about their dislike of minorities and what have you. It was just a fact of life. But we lived in the far northwest part of Oklahoma City, and it was a fairly long way from downtown Oklahoma City. So there was a little bus company that sprung up called the Nichols Hills Transportation Company that you'd get on one of their buses to go downtown. The regular city buses didn't come out. And I can remember getting on those buses and saw the sign colored to the rear. I can remember gas stations that had segregated bathrooms with signs out in front of it. And you knew that was wrong, but nobody ever talked about it, so you never had any questions about it. And so lately with this movie, Killers of the Flower Moon, about the Osage murders in Oklahoma, and then the recent writings on the Tulsa race riots, which just wiped out the whole black middle class up there, there was a big lid on that. I did not know about either of those events until the latter part of the 20th century when people started writing about it. And I went all the way through school up there, and I never heard them either one of those things, the Tulsa race riots or the Osage County murders, ever talked about. It's like they never existed. In fact, I'm still in touch with a goodly number of my friends from high school. And I remember the first time after things started being written on that, I was up there for an event with some of my high school classmates, and we all looked at one another and said, were we all absent that day they taught that in the schools? Because none of us had ever heard of that part of Oklahoma history.
Yeah. Well, thinking about your years moving into high school at UT, tell us some folks, some individuals, or somebody that made a difference in your life, that showed kindness or leadership or direction.
Let me start out with an apology to Kathleen, who thought this was going to be about kindness that I had observed in the court system in my career.
We're headed that way. And
once I talked to Merrill, this kind of morphed into something about all the people that were kind to me, and there was a whole lot of them, I'll tell you that. My parents were divorced, so I grew up with my mother, and I'd say the person that was most important, there were several, but the most important one was there were some young guys. Bear in mind, this is the late 1950s, and there wasn't a pizza restaurant on every corner. In fact, most of the time, if you wanted a pizza, you went to a nice Italian place. And then the Pizza Huts started. That was the first chain. They started in Kansas. And these three guys, it was two brothers and a guy that was married to their sister, their brother-in-law, and they came back out of the Air Force and lived in Wichita, and they found out about Pizza Hut, and they were looking around for something to do, and they went and talked, and apparently the Pizza Huts even then wanted a big number on their franchise, and they didn't want to pay it, so they looked around to try to find a place that was close enough to Wichita where they could see their family and that didn't have a pizza restaurant in it. So they came to Oklahoma City, and on the northwest side of Oklahoma City, they founded a place called the Pizza Planet. Our pizza is out of this world, if you want to know what the slogan is. And a friend of my mother's had run into one of them somewhere when they first opened, and they were looking for kids or people to work. And so I went to work mopping floors and scrubbing bake pans when I was 14. I think I was making 35 cents an hour. Even with inflation, that wasn't very much money. And ended up working with them all the way through high school. And when I graduated, I was night manager at the restaurant. And so I'd take my books in there, and when it was slow, I'd sit down and study and work. And the guy that really kind of ran it was a man named Carl McAllister. And probably were it not for him, I might have ended up in somebody's jail. He was really a fine man, and he guided me through an awful lot of things. I learned a lot working for him, and a lot of responsibility, because he gave me a lot of responsibility. I mean, that's just the kind of guy he was. Because I was really I was 17 years old, and I had control of the money at night. I was the one that shut the restaurant down at 10 o'clock. I was the one that put the money in the safe. And it wasn't until after that I realized all the trust he had put in me to let a 17-year-old kid be doing that kind of stuff.
So you graduate from UT surprisingly. You didn't know when you could graduate from UT. Tell that story.
Well, I'll preface it by saying really who you're looking at up here is Forrest Gump. I've kind of just cakewalked through life and shown up at some places where things have just kind of worked out. And what I thought was the spring of my junior year at the University of Texas, they send you to a degree checker who's a graduate student who has all your transcripts, and he does this making sure where you are in your hours. Are you getting enough hours to graduate on time? Do you have enough in your major? Do you have enough in your minor? And I'm just sitting there kind of dozing, and he's going over this, and suddenly he looks up and says, "You're just brilliant." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I've never seen anybody work this out as well as you did." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "Oh, no, come on, you got to know." I said, "No." And he says, "If you take 12 hours this summer, which are 2 courses for each summer session, you graduate at the end of the summer." And so I'm thinking, I'm going to graduate in 3 years. And he said, "You didn't know that?" And I said, "No." And he said, "You'll have exactly as many hours as you need to graduate. You'll be over in your major. You'll be over in your minor. In fact, you could have had a double major had you declared for it." And I said, "Well, I didn't even know I was close to graduating, so I wasn't even thinking about declaring a double major." And so then I had to figure out what I was going to do. And, this was 1966, and there's a little thing was beginning to develop over in Southeast Asia. And so I thought, well, I worked that summer in Houston and business, and I always wanted to be in business. There'd never been a lawyer in our family. And that's one of the reasons I was able to graduate in 3 years, because our family were all doctors. So my first year, I took pre-med, and so they stack you with all of these hours, all your hard courses, your math and science. And I took 17 hours each semester, and I had some advanced placement. And then after that first year, when I changed my major over to government, then everything was easy after that. You couldn't have a hard course after you'd taken all your math and science. And so I went over, I was going to go and work on an MBA, and I took the graduate record exam and went over and talked to business school, and everything was fine, except they said you didn't have enough undergraduate hours in business, and you got to go back and get 30 hours, don't flunk anything, but your grades are not particularly important, we'll let you in. Well, that's that whole year I thought I'd just made up, so that wasn't going to work. And so the second way you could get ahead in business was you come through the corporate counsel's office. So I thought I'll go to trade school, I'll go to law school, and I'll come up through those ranks. And so I think I signed up for the law school admissions exam the last day you could do it in order to go in the fall. Now people, start planning on law school 2 years out and this and that and the other. But I literally made a last-minute decision on it, and because I absolutely knew I was going to go to law school and go into the corporate world and be a businessman. From that point on, the only time I ever set foot in a corporate boardroom was when I was delivering a report on some lawsuit I was handling for them, because the great philosopher Yogi Berra was right. When you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I had a lot of forks, and I took a lot of them, and it just kind of worked out.
So you became a lawyer, 28 years. What are some of the memories of that experience?
Well, I got out of law school in 1969, and Austin was different in 1969, and the practice of law in Austin was different in 1969. It was a very sleepy little town. None of these big major law firms had come to town then. There were 4 homegrown big law firms at that time, and a big law firm was like 30 lawyers or maybe 25 lawyers. The firm that I took a part-time job with when I retired from the bench, just so I'd have something to do, has 1,600 lawyers spread out in 25 offices all over the world. And that's a whole new experience for me. But the business of Austin in 1969 was government and education. It was the university and it was the state complex. And that was basically what it was. And so I went to work. Very few of my law school classmates stayed in Austin because there weren't any jobs here. And I probably wouldn't have stayed in Austin except for, once again, one of these strange series of events. All the jobs were in Dallas, Houston. And I ended up staying here with a little bitty law firm called Mitchell, Gilbert, and McLean, and it was Mitchell, Gilbert, McLean, and Yeakel. I was the associate. So one day you'd get sent to do a civil case, one day you'd get sent to do a criminal case, one day you'd get sent to federal court, one day you'd get sent to state court. And they would just throw you into things that with my level of experience, I had no business getting thrown into. But you learn, in the words of a client I had later, they can cook you, but they can't eat you. Well, I got cooked a lot when I was a young lawyer, but I was never eaten. So it worked out pretty well. And we just stayed in Austin and just kind of watched Austin grow up around us and watched the practice of law change around us. And as Merrill said, I practiced. I didn't go on the bench young. I practiced for 28 and a half years and then became a judge and was a judge for 25 years, which just lets you know that I'm one of the really old people in this room. And it staggers me to think I've had a law license for 54 years. It's never been revoked. It's yellowed, but it's never been revoked.
So talk about involvement in politics in the 90s and where that led.
Well, it started for me earlier than that. I'd always had an interest, once I graduated from college, in politics and got involved. More people got involved then. I think we won't get off on a political discussion here, but I think part of the problem with the political system we have today is there are not as many just normal average Americans that get involved in politics, that go down and lick stamps at headquarters or address postcards for people or do things like that. And everybody did a lot of that, and I got involved in politics because I was interested in it in Austin and managed to forge a whole career of losing elective races. I have a great dismal record in elective politics myself. It worked out in the end, but we did, with Ann, my wife, we were precinct chairman here, ran elections here in the precincts, and I went on in the late 80s to be Republican Party chairman in Travis County, which I call the world's worst unpaid job. I mean, there weren't any Republicans then any more than there are already now. But it's funny how the world turns, because there'd be people that'd cross the street to avoid talking to me because I was Republican Party chairman, and then 6 weeks later they were calling me wanting to know how to get a hold of one of the Bushes, because guess what got popular? The other side, the world always turns. And so I did every kind of little homegrown job you could do in politics. Like a lot of Austin, I started out as a Democrat. The first race I lost was a Democrat, and realized at that point that even though we had the two-party system called conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats were going away, and a whole lot of that was people started moving to Texas, and we'd had the history here of the conservative Democrats and the liberal Democrats, and so everything got decided in the primary, and it was always a two-party system. They just both had the same last name, and the November election didn't mean anything. Well, when people started moving in here from New York and California and Pennsylvania and Illinois, they didn't have the patience to have the way we did it in Texas, as we'd say in Texas, explained to them. If you're liberal, you're a Democrat. If you're conservative, you're a Republican. So at some point, the move-in people caused Texas to reach critical mass where it became acceptable to be a Republican, and a lot of what had been conservative Democrats moved over to the Republican Party. And it was kind of fun to watch it grow, kind of like it's been fun to watch Austin grow. I miss a lot of the old places. I miss hippie Austin. But very few people have had the opportunity to move into a small town and watch it grow into a world-class city in one generation. This town has grown faster than New York. It took New York a lot longer than it's taken Austin to get where it is now, and it's just been an interesting ride to watch all of that.
So what was the occasion of you, Texas State Appellate Court? How did that happen?
I had not really given a whole lot of thought to ever being a judge. There are lawyers that get out of law school and the first thing they want to do is try to figure out how to be a judge. But I grew up in kind of a different time where there were very few judges when I got out of law school, state or federal, who were young judges. The tradition was that you became a judge to cap a career, that being a judge wasn't your career. And they were great judges because they'd all had great legal careers. They were really good to young lawyers. They would counsel you, they would mentor you. And there was some real, I practiced in front of a lot of them for the 28 and a half years. You know, the whole kind of theme of this story is, and I know you've heard this, but it's the story of my life. If you're walking down a country road and you see a fence post with a turtle on top of it, you can bet that turtle didn't get there by himself. Well, that's kind of what I did. And all these judges taught me a lot. And so I never really considered it because you make a lot more money practicing law than you do in the judiciary. You don't go in the judiciary to make money. And we had 2 kids we wanted to get out of college and get them out of college without any debt. And so Ann became executive director of the Texas Bar Foundation, which is the nonprofit organization of the Texas lawyers. And the National Conference of Bar Foundation executives always met in conjunction with the American Bar Association annual meeting. And so I never went to a whole lot of those meetings, except if it was meeting in a city I liked to go to. I knew she had a hotel room, and we generally had enough Southwest vouchers that we'd go. And one year the annual meeting was going to be in San Francisco, and we were flying out there and happened to run into 2 judges that I knew. One was a district judge here and one was a Supreme Court judge, and they were Democrats, and we were flying out there, and one of them looked at me and said, "I just had a great idea. You ought to run for this 3rd court, this intermediate appellate court vacancy." And I said, "Oh, you know, I don't want to do that. There's never been a Republican ever elected to that court. And, you know, I'm not going to do it." And I said, "Plus, I don't believe in an elected judiciary. I don't think judges ought to be political. And the judge that has that position now is doing a good job. He's one of my law school classmates, and he lives around the corner from us, and our kids grew up together. In fact, his oldest daughter's a lawyer that's in the same building where my law firm was, and I'm not going to get on the elevator every morning and have her look at me, 'You're trying to put my daddy out of work.' I said, "So I'm just not going to do it." Well, one of these judges that we were on the plane with was really well connected in Democratic politics, and he looked at me and said, "I don't think Judge Powers is going to run for office." And I said, "Are you telling me Judge Powers is not going to run for re-election?" And he said, "I'm just saying that." So then they both started pounding on me as we flew to San Francisco, and we got out there, and Ann says, "Well, what do you think you're going to do?" And I said, "Well, I got to find out what Judge Powers is going to do. I'm not going to run against him." So I knew where he went to breakfast every morning, and so I just showed up over there one time and said, "Can I join you?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Are you running for re-election?" And without hesitation, he said, "No." I was really kind of surprised because I hadn't read anything. I said, "Well, I've heard a rumor about that, but that's definite." And he said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "You know, Lee, I don't give press conferences. I don't do things like that." But he said, "I've got grandchildren now, and, you know, I'm tired of doing it, so I'm not going to run again." So I got involved, and our kids were out of college by then. I don't think I would have even thought about running for the judiciary if we'd still been putting kids through college. And so that started me down the judicial road.
And it led to a federal seat, a federal judge.
Most state court judges, even though we elect our judges here, originally get there because there'll be a vacancy, and the governor gets to appoint a person to fill the vacancy until the next general election. So I'm out running for this place on the Third Court of Appeals, and just before the primary was going to be in March, and I had an opponent in the Republican primary, and then there were two Democrats running. The Chief Justice of that court in January called me. He was an old friend of mine, and said, "This is not a secret, but not very many people know it. I just want to tell you, and you can make whatever use of it you want to." He said, "I'm resigning in 2 weeks." And I said, "Well, why?" Well, he was from Temple, which is in the Third Court of Appeals district. And Scott and White hadn't merged with Baylor then. Scott and White was the largest homegrown Central Texas entity there was. And their general counsel was retiring, and they had asked him to become general counsel of Scott and White. So he was going to get to move back to Temple. He was probably going to quadruple his salary. I don't know what they pay. And if you're a Temple boy, you know, can there be a more prestigious position to go home to than general counsel of the largest place there? And so George W. Bush was governor, and he appointed me to fill that unexpired term until I had to run again in November. So I didn't end up running in that primary. I went on the bench right then to fill the vacancy.
Now, what do you remember about the first time you sat on the federal bench? I mean, what sort of memories do you have?
Well, that came
of
later.
Yeah.
Because Governor Bush became President Bush, and he didn't forget the people he left behind. You can think what you will about the Bush family. In our family, there are patrons for the last part of my life, I tell you. But it was after going through all of the confirmation process and everything, which I thought was an absolute nightmare. And now I look at what these people are going through that are getting nominated now, and I didn't realize how really easy I had it. That's a whole different story, the way it was managed then and the way it's managed now. I believe the system's broken right now. It may or may not get fixed, but it was a big thing. If you spent your entire active adult life in the law and you didn't like being a federal judge, there's something wrong with you. Let me tell you, very few people get to be federal judge. It's one of the rare positions in this country where you're appointed for life. The way the Constitution reads is you serve on good behavior. And let me tell you, anytime you read about a federal judge that they're trying to remove for bad behavior, he or she didn't stumble into it. The good behavior bar is a really high bar. You have to try to climb over it to get in trouble on bad behavior. It's kind of hard to do. And it really does give you the freedom to consider cases and rule on them the way you want to. I think the founders got it right in the way they designed the judicial system. I realize that that's controversial now. Most of the public doesn't like appointed for life. But it's a system the founders worked out that worked. And it was a big responsibility because you get big cases and you know they make a lot of difference. I had a law professor one time out at the university who said that being a United States district judge, which is what I was, a trial judge, is really the most important job in the judiciary because you're a single judge, so you make your own decisions. You don't have to work with a panel like the Supreme Court. 9 judges debate and come up with every decision. On the intermediate appellate courts, the circuit courts, they sit in 3-judge panels. But when you're on a trial bench, it's just you. And as this law professor put it, he said, you will think, if you ever become one of these judges, that you get appealed all the time. But if you ever looked at the numbers, you don't. You remember them because you're appealed. But most cases aren't appealed. And he said, then you're going to think you get reversed a lot because you remember your reversals by the higher courts. But he said, you don't get reversed very much. So what you do, for the most part, by a huge number, is you make the decisions that end right at your court and directly affect people's lives. And I always remembered that. And it's kind of an awesome responsibility because if you have a pulse, you have to think about it, you know.
Talk about a couple of the sort of high public cases that you that you were the judge, I think of the Julie Kasurik. Y'all remember that, what happened? Can you give us a little details about that?
Well, that's a particularly interesting case because it probably never should have been in federal court anyway. I probably never should have tried that. And so it's kind of an interesting story, and I don't have to get into a lot of legalese to do it. But Judge Kasurik was a state judge here who was assassinated. She didn't die. She's horribly injured. It was just a horrible thing. It was in the presence of her son, and the guy just shot her. And normally you would think, because most crimes against the person, physical crimes, are state crimes. And there used to only be like 1 or 2 federal crimes that were crimes against the person. That was left to the states. Kidnapping was one, and there's something else. Now with terrorism, there are a lot more of those that are in federal court. And you would think, I would have thought that the guy that shot Judge Kasurik when they caught him would be tried in state court on attempt to murder a judge. But there's a difference in sentencing in state court and federal court. In federal court, there is no parole. If you get the sentence, you do the time. There's no parole. Anytime you hear that so-and-so got X number of years and they'll be out in another number of years, you automatically know that's a state sentence. And judges do all of the sentencing in federal court. Juries don't do any of the sentencing. Juries do sentencings in state court. And I can tell you, and I think everybody that's been a United States District Judge will tell you, the hardest and least pleasant part of the job is sentencing. There's no way I can put a happy face on having to sentence people. Well, this guy was not going to get the death penalty. It was not a death penalty. The state could have indicted him under the death penalty statute, but they weren't going to because the judge didn't die, and bad though it was, it'd be hard to get a death penalty conviction. So they knew the most he could get in state court would be life. And the way the numbers work in state court, if you get a life sentence, it converts for purposes of considering a parole to a 40-year sentence. And you got to serve half of it, so he could be out for this heinous crime in 20 years. And nobody in law enforcement thought that was right. So they wanted to try to figure out a way to get him tried in federal court. So if he was convicted and got life, it'd be life without parole. He would never get out. And so it was really interesting the way the state and the federal government did it. The state assigned an assistant district attorney over to the United States Attorney's Office. And she and a United States attorney put this case together under the RICO statutes, the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act, on the basis of, because this guy was running a tax fraud and credit card scam, and if they could link that in to where the assassination attempt was part and parcel of that crime, then with the way the federal statutes work on the various counts of conviction, that if the jury found the individual guilty of the right number of counts and understood the court's charge and got it right, then he could get a life sentence if the judge sentenced him to a life sentence, and then that means he was just gone. And it was really difficult, but they got an indictment on that, and it came on for trial in my court, and I think I tried it for like 3 weeks, and the jury understood everything and answered the questions in the right way. But it was, I'm going to tell you, he had stalked her when they got his cell phone, and that was one of the interesting parts of the trial, because he knew they were looking for him because one of his Confederates had ratted him out. And so he's in Houston in a car with some other people, and a Houston police car flashes its light and comes, and he knows they're after him. And so he takes his cell phone and he stomps it into the most pieces he can stomp it in. Well, in your cell phone, there is one little chip that you can't see. And there is a woman, and this is better than any CSI show you'll ever see on television. She testified in my court twice when I was on the bench at the FBI's lab in Quantico, Virginia. And if she can find that chip, you just can't believe what she can do with it. And so the police in Houston swept all the pieces into this plastic bag, and if FBI sent it to Quantico, and they've got a machine to where if this woman can find that little chip and put it in there, everything that's ever been on your cell phone is in there. If you think when you erase something it's erased, you're just wrong. I mean, it's got everything you've erased, everything on it, and this woman got it. And so she testified at the trial, and they asked her, said, well, how many 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper would you have had to print out to have everything on the phone? And it was over 100,000 because he had had his phone a long time. I mean, that's how much stuff that gets stored on your phone. Every phone call you ever made, every picture you ever took, no matter what you thought you wrote. And so they did a word search to come up with things. And when they got in there, they put on the most remarkable. He had photographs of the license plate of every car the family owned, any number of things. He had videos where he had followed them from time to time, and it was just a compelling tale they put together. But they had to work hard to put it together. I thought the crime justified life in prison, and I sentenced him to life in prison, and he's there today. The appeals are over. He appealed it to the Fifth Circuit and then tried to get the Supreme Court to hear it, and the Supreme Court didn't hear it. But it was a chilling case to try, and he probably had killed 2 people in Houston and got by with it. And I think he thought he was bulletproof because he took the witness stand and testified. Really bad thing to do. I knew his lawyers, and I will guarantee you neither one of them told him to testify, that he insisted on doing it, and admitted he was the shooter, but he just meant to scare her. Well, I can tell you what the jury thought about that. And if there was ever any doubt about the strength of the prosecution's case, when he admitted to being the shooter, it made everything easier for the judge and for everything else. But you get those kind of cases, and it was a long case, and you got to keep order in your courtroom. You got to make sure the press doesn't overrun your courtroom. You got to make sure the lawyers don't showboat too much. They're hard for the judge. I'm not up here to be apologist for the judges, but there are cases that you have to try differently as a judge than other cases that you try as a judge.
So in those years, as when you were lawyering and when you were judging, you experienced what seems so out of touch with our life now. You saw some bipartisanship in many settings.
Yes.
And most of us here, we don't see it anywhere. We have no confidence that the Republicans and the Democrats can work together. Just talk about that a little bit, what you've seen in the past and where you actually see where we're going right now, because it is hard.
Well, it's all happened quickly. I mean, there was always 2 parties, but for the most part, and there have always been exceptions, people that we elected to go to Washington went to Washington to solve problems and to work together and solve problems. My mantra kind of is, if Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan can make deals, anybody can make deals. Because neither one of them was ever accused of selling out Republicans or Democrats or liberals and conservatives. And they were both strong individuals, and they would fight for what they want. And then when they got as far as they could go, they'd see that they weren't getting farther, they'd make the deal at that point and move on. And now, everyone, I hate to be this cynical, but I think there are very few people, if any, in Washington that are trying to solve the country's problems. They're just trying to argue about the problems and blame them on somebody else as opposed to getting them solved. And it's just wrong. It's not the way it used to work, and it's not the way that it was supposed to work. I'd alluded to the fact when I went through the confirmation process. Now you see these judges are confirmed or not confirmed by the Senate on straight party line votes. Now, I'm going to tell you that all Republicans didn't think that person would make a good judge or a bad judge, and all Democrats didn't think make a good judge or a bad judge. They just voted on party lines instead of anything to have to do with the individual. And when I'd been through the process, and once you get out of the Judiciary Committee with a favorable report, then they just kind of tag you on to the end of some session in whatever order you've come out of the Judiciary Committee on when they're going to vote on you. So I was back in Austin, I'd had my hearing, and so I'd get a call from Senator Cornyn and Senator Hutchinson were the two senators in Texas that were there when I went through, that I'd get a call from one of their offices that said, well, they're going to vote tonight. And well, then they didn't vote, and it goes back and forth. And so one day I got a call about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that said, this is an absolute, you and Judge Cardone, Kathleen Cardone, who was a nominee for an El Paso bench, are going to be voted on when we finish the business agenda at 5 o'clock, which is 6 o'clock Austin time. So you can get anything on C-SPAN. So we're at my office in the Third Court of Appeals and have the C-SPAN Senate channel on, and sure enough, up comes Yeakel and Cardone's names. And so Senator Hutchinson and Senator Cornyn both get up and make glowing reports on what good judges will be and how they ought to vote on me. And then I said, Senator Leahy will deliver the Democrat response, and there's kind of a groan from my staff. I said, no, don't worry about that. I'll tell you what Senator Leahy's going to do. We don't have any problem with Senator Leahy. He's going to get up and talk about how the Democrats have been better to George W. Bush's nominees than the Republicans were to Bill Clinton's nominees, and he's going to make his point, but then we don't have any problem. So Leahy gets up, and Senator Leahy gets up and says exactly what he's going to. And you know, if you've ever watched C-SPAN, the camera never moves. It just stays focused on the podium. So suddenly, at the end of his talk, Senator Leahy says, but this time the president got it right. And tonight when we're going to vote, I'm going to vote in favor of. He starts going through his papers, and it's clear he's either forgotten our names or never knew our names. And he starts shuffling through his papers, and he starts looking around. You can see him look like he's trying to get an aide to come over. So finally, he just scoops all his papers up and says, so tonight when we vote, I'm going to vote for the woman and the other guy. And so if you've ever wanted to know who the other guy is, you always hear about the other guy, it's me. I've got a copy of that transcript from the Senate that I'm the other guy. And Judge Cardone really loved it because she likes being the woman. She had the annals of the Senate is now the woman. And so we got through, and I became a federal judge.
So do you mind if I ask if anybody has a question or a comment?
I'd love to answer questions.
Yeah, so, yes. I'll bring it to you. And introduce yourself when you do, please.
Judge Yeakel, Jeff Hobbs, welcome to St. Matthews.
Yes.
I was talking to Christian and Jeff. We're happening to sit in the lawyer section, it appears. Kind of in the theme of kindness, I've got a question from your perspective on the bench, because in my experience, I think we have a pretty collegial and civil bar. I like the lawyers in Austin. I think we generally get along, but it is an adversarial system. There are haymakers thrown, there are stressful times, there are emotional times, and you see that. Among all that, can you tell us, in the judicial system in Austin, what are some of the acts of kindness that you might see on a day-to-day basis that some of the lawyers take for granted and some of the people in this room who don't have experience with the judicial system might not appreciate?
I think that was part of why Kathleen called me and asked me to do this. And when I started thinking about it, and Merrill had mentioned acronyms, antonyms earlier, I got to thinking, and I'm not in the business when I was a judge where you see a lot of acts of kindness. I'm kind of on the other side of that. I see it the other way. I appreciate what you said about the Austin Bar, because when I started practicing, when it was much smaller, as I said, in the 60s, we always prided ourselves in Austin that we had a better bar and we got along better. And one of the reasons was there were very few lawyers here, and so you might try 3 lawsuits in 3 weeks against the same lawyer. You were going to see the same lawyer all the time, so you just got along better. And we used to call the really horsey lawyers, the ones you didn't like, they were the 214 and 713 lawyers. And it doesn't take you long to figure out where those numbers came from. It was always somebody from Houston or Dallas that was causing trouble. Well, as Austin grew, and the bar got a lot larger, a lot of us were worried that we were going to lose that sense of collegiality. And I will say there are more lawyers that you've got trouble with now that you've got to watch and you've got to deal with than there were before. But Austin is still unique. When I was on the bench, if one of my law clerks came in and said, you really need to get these lawyers in because they're having problems and you need to talk to them a little bit, I didn't ask who they were, I asked where they were from. That was my first question. And there was never, and I mean never, a time where the answer was they're both from Austin. Usually they were both from out of town, because we get a lot of out of town lawyers. Always, at least one of them was an out of town lawyer. So there's subtle acts of kindness, but the lawyers do get along better here. It is not a misconception that this is a good place to practice law because of the collegiality the lawyers have. I never had any trouble in my courtroom I never had a gavel on my bench. I was a judge for 25 years and I never pounded a gavel. The lawyers behaved. I had this idea because I tried a lot of lawsuits and been, as I said, in front of a lot of judges, that you could maintain order in your courtroom and not be arrogant about it. And I tried to get that through to the lawyers, and for the most part, I was successful, and the ones that I wasn't successful with, I converted. You know, when you're a federal judge, you can do a lot of things, and it intimidates a lot of people. And it's one of the things I miss since I retired is I don't have my inherent powers anymore. And let me tell you, inherent powers are good things to have. Let me tell you that.
You never pounded the gavel, not even for the fun of it, eh? You just wouldn't do it. All right. Yes.
Hi, Father. Your Honor, Jeff Jury, it's been a long time.
It has been.
Good to see you, and thanks for being here. So I have a different kind of question. As I've followed your career, you were the judge who issued some orders that were unpopular with one segment, and the thing that struck me were the number of times that you, of all people, were excoriated for being a judicial activist, for legislating from the bench, and knowing you and your philosophy, many of us knew that just wasn't true. I'm wondering how you dealt with that, because in our conversations here in our community, we talk about all of the difficulties. We're here, we've got a program dedicated to kindness, so instead of thinking about dealing with other people, how did you deal with that internally?
When you're appointed forever, it's a good feeling. It is the ultimate sticks and stones may break my bones and words can never hurt me appointment. That's why I said I think the founders got it right, because what I was supposed to do as a judge, and I considered myself, and I appreciate your comments, to be conservative, not in the political sense, but it's the judiciary, the third branch of government, is the least democratic branch of government. The judges are appointed, and they're appointed for life. There's no democratic access to that other than you elect the president who appoints the judges, and you elect the senators who confirm the judges. But when you get to the judges, it's very indirect. And there's a reason for that, is the founders. Now, let me give you a disclaimer and say, everybody in the world, everybody in this room knows exactly what the Constitution means. And what the Constitution means is what 5 people in Washington say it means that day. Let me just tell you, nobody knows what the Constitution means, and it's one of the, I think it's one of the geniuses of the document. But I always perceive the judiciary as what I'm supposed to do is determine what the facts of the situation are. And the lawyers, and rightly so, spin the facts. And it's all right to spin the facts. You can't lie about them, but you have to be an advocate, and so you're supposed to give to the court your strongest facts, and the other side gives your strong. But then it's up to the judge to go through what are often very, very good arguments about what the lawyers think the record shows as to the facts, and reach our own decision. Okay, we've read everything. We have determined that these are the facts in this case. Then you look at the law and apply the law to the facts. And I would tell my staff all the time, you follow the law wherever it leads you. Now, a lot of people, maybe some in this room, look at what judges do and say, I could never separate my personal beliefs and just follow the law. I can't do that. Well, you can. You just haven't trained yourself to do it. You know, I was trained in the law. I became a judge. It's my job, and my job is to put my personal opinions out of it as a judge and just rule on what I think the law is. And I can tell you, over the course of my 25 years on the bench, if I had been in a legislature or the Congress, I probably would have voted differently on issues than the way I ruled on the court, but that wasn't my job. The legislative branch and the executive branch are the political branches of government who are supposed to set the policy for this country. The courts aren't supposed to set policy. You don't find any policy. Now, unfortunately, we have a lot of judges today, I can talk now that I'm not one of them, that don't know what branch of government they're in. And I think that's more prevalent today than it's ever been, that you have judges that I think are rightfully accused of legislating from the bench. I think the media has driven that a lot, and I'm not talking about liberal media or conservative media in that debate. It's, you don't read an article about what a court did without saying, Lee Yeakel, appointed by George W. Bush, did this, as if, you know, I'm supposed to do everything George W. Bush would have done as President of the United States, or my colleague when I left the bench, Robert Pittman, appointed by Barack Obama, did as if he's supposed to do what everything, and it's just not that. And then you read the all-Republican Texas Supreme Court did this, or the all-Democratic court did this. And the media has been pounding that on the public for so long. They've instilled in the public, I think, a much stronger belief that the judiciary is just one more political branch of government. And then unfortunately, because I do think we have judges that are that way now that maybe we didn't have as many of before, the judiciary is kind of playing into their hands on that. But what I did, and of course the most controversial case that I was excoriated on numerous occasions by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, was the Whole Woman's Health case, which involved abortion. And that was a big case. Let me tell you, when you're on the bench and a case walks in your door, it doesn't surprise you later that it was a big case. You know, you've been in law all your life. And so I knew when that case hit that it was a case we had to be careful with and we had to look at very carefully. And at that time, because I have to follow the Supreme Court of the United States, if it is one thing the Supreme Court of the United States had been, at that time, totally consistent with since the Roe versus Wade opinion, is that a woman had an absolute right to abortion until the fetus was viable outside the womb. And in all of their other writings, they were that way. So when I got in and looked at the case, the Texas legislature had changed that test, which meant it was a bad statute, period, because the Supreme Court said this is right. Now, they've since changed that, of course, and so when we got in there and worked on it, it was merely a question of following the precedent and determining whether that statute passed constitutional muster, and it didn't. Well, so I rule that way. Well, now you got to understand how I look on the other courts. You always hear about the Supreme Court and the Circuit Court and the District Court, and it's the higher courts. I look on them as a horizontal line, not a vertical line, that you have district judges, you have circuit judges, you have Supreme Court justices. None of those as a group, judges, are one of those groups is smarter than the circuit. The appellate judges are not smarter than district judges as a group. They're not better educated than district judges as a group. They're not wiser than district judges as a group. They're just different judges. And that's the way the system works, and I'm comfortable with that because there should be an appellate procedure, but you should never get involved in thinking that people who get appointed to the Supreme Court are better people that got appointed to the district bench and all along. And so one of the things you got to get used to when you're a district judge is you get to speak, and you get to speak first. And that's the only time you get to speak. You know, it's out of your hands. I would tell the lawyers in cases like the abortion case, I said, you're going to think this is a big case in my court. Well, let me tell you, we're just the whistle stop on the railroad. The train's going to leave here and it's got to go to New Orleans to the Fifth Circuit, and then if it's a big enough deal, the train's going to go to to Washington, to the Supreme Court. And so an emergency panel of the circuit gets it and just writes this horrible opinion that calls me all kinds of names. And I remember what a district judge I used to practice in front of him named Lucius Bunton once said. He said, you know, they can write these opinions, but they can't make me read them, you know. And so they did what they were going to do. And then it goes to the regular panel of the Fifth Circuit, another group of three of them who they're even worse on me than the last one was. And so then the Supreme Court takes a case. And nobody knew what the Supreme Court was going to do. Scalia had died, so there were only 8 of them that were going to rule on it. And the media was all, you know, making book on how it was going to come out, and you kind of have a feel how it is. And the opinion doesn't come out, and it doesn't come out, and it doesn't come out. So we get to the last day of that Supreme Court term. So you knew they were going to announce it that day. Well, it turned out, and I were going to New York that day. And so our plane was going to leave at 9 o'clock, which is 10 o'clock Washington time. So we think, oh, we're good. We're going to know how that opinion came out. And so at 8 o'clock Austin time, 9 o'clock Washington time, the Supreme Court comes out, and they don't release any opinions. They release a whole bunch of orders on things. So we get on the airplane, and Ann is looking on her phone. We're holding it down here, you know, at the SCOTUS Supreme Court of the United States blog that said, at 10 o'clock Washington time, they're going to release opinions. And so they close the door on the airplane, so you got to turn off your phones, and we're kind of hiding it down there. And Ann says, it says here, whole woman's health, opinion by Justice Breyer. I said, turn your phone off. They've reversed the circuit. They've reinstated my opinion because Breyer wasn't one that was going to change. Everybody was concerned about what Kennedy was going to do. Whether he was going to rule one way or the other way. But when Breyer wrote the opinion, I knew that it was going to be our way. So we get to New York, and so in the cab going from the airport to the hotel, we're reading it on the phone, you know, this whole opinion. And we get to the hotel now. New York, you know, sees a lot of strange things. We immediately went in the restaurant and ordered a bottle of champagne. And I don't think they were used to these crazy Texans coming in and drinking champagne at that time of day. But regardless of what the issue was in that case, one of the reasons it's memorable to me is I knew when I read Justice Breyer's opinion, it was a once-in-a-career opinion because usually the trial court is never mentioned in these big cases. It's always whether they're going to affirm or reverse the circuit court. And that, as I said, we're a whistle stop on the railroad. And Breyer went through this, that the circuit court said such and such. The trial court said this and that. The trial court was right. And it just goes through like that. And I read that and I said, I'll never get another opinion like that as long as I serve on the court. So it was a big deal. You listen to that stuff, you read that stuff, but you got to believe in the system and let it just be water off a duck's back. And I find great solace in thinking they're not any smarter than I am. So I was giving a lecture out the law school one time, and one of the kids said, well, Judge, have you ever been reversed? And I said, yes, I have. And she said, well, was the circuit ever wrong when they reversed you? And I said, every time they reversed me, they were wrong. And it took her a minute to understand what I was saying, and finally the rest of the class got it, you know. I wouldn't have written it that way if I thought it was wrong, you know. That's what it is.
We have time for one more, if anybody else has a question before we close. I know, Kathleen, you want to speak, right, before we close? Yeah. Anybody else?
Come on, Kathleen, you're bound to have a question. You set this whole deal up.
I will say that Kathleen said that the reason she wanted you to do this as a friend and as a judge is because you are a kind person.
Well,
And that's,
this turned out to be way too much about me and not enough about what I think Kathleen wanted it to
Well,
be.
all I have to say is this has been really interesting, hasn't it? And extremely instructive. Thank you, Lee Yeakel, and thank you. What was your name again? Is Katie here? Katie? There she is. Oh, good. And don't forget, next week, Sharon Watkins will come and talk to us. And she will be interviewed by Katie.
Just because we're in a church, we're going to do a closing benediction. So the Lord be with you. And because God is everywhere, not just in this church, we thank you for your presence, gracious God, in this conversation and all of our conversations. May we move forward with kindness, seeing our decisions as part of the whole and part of systems. Amen.